Hi, hopefully you'll be able to hear me live now. My name is Adam. I am Associate Collections Curator here at the Yorkshire Museum. A very warm welcome. Thanks for joining us on this rainy day here in York. The talk this evening is about Mars, the Roman god of war, as particularly related to a series that we're doing on the Rydale Hoard. The Rydale Hoard is a group of 4 copper alloy objects which were found by a metal detectorist in Rydale, North Yorkshire in 2020 and acquired by the Yorkshire Museum last year. It currently forms part of an ongoing exhibition here in the museum until May next year. So there's a series of talks, one every other month, and this is quite an informal one where we're going to explore an aspect of one of the 4 objects in the hoard, and we're going to look today at Mars. So the figurine that I have in front of me is the Roman god Mars as a cavalryman. We're going to look at this in detail as we get towards the later part of the talk, but he's one of the 4 objects that are depicted in the hoard. Mars is the Roman god of war. It's probably a very familiar name to most people out there. Within Roman Britain, he's very much a character that was imported with the Roman army, and when they appeared first with Julius Caesar in 55-54 BC, and then with the invading army in AD 43, the invading and occupying Roman army, which then gradually spread the influence of the Roman god, travelling primarily with the Roman legions and the auxiliary troops further north. So York is a Roman settlement, and there are several other settlements all dotted in and around Yorkshire. It is a very military area, and we're going to think about why that might be important for the role of this statue in the hoard. So before we get to that, I'm going to introduce a sort of a classical depiction of Mars. We have here, so in the case to the side. So this object's on loan to us from the British Museum, which is why we can't take it out of the case. But this is a very traditional, classical representation of Mars. It's late Republican in date, and you can see, so he's a tall, bearded, muscular chap. He's not a youthful figure in this one. He's sort of middle-aged, and he's wearing this very ornate cuirass, the body armor. It's got a little archaic figure of a gorgon right in the center of the chest, and other sort of medals dotted around his stomach, which is how he sort of wear these things. He's wearing this plated skirt beneath them, and he is wearing a pair of greaves, so there is armor from his knee down to his ankles. He's usually depicted wearing sandals, but he's barefoot in this one. Right at the top of his head, it doesn't look Roman because it isn't, is a Greek-style helmet. This is on like a hoplite helmet. And this is an allusion to the idea that Mars, the Roman god of war, is very much inherited from Ares, the Greek god of war. They're quite similar in how they're formed. So he has his 2 hands out in front of him in this one. They're both absent because in this depiction he's lost his kind of symbols of his office, which would have been a spear and a shield. So this is a very traditional representation of Mars. Now we're going to turn and look to the largest representation of Mars, and probably the most familiar to anybody who's been to the Yorkshire Museum and sort of familiar with the sort of material that we have here. So here we have an almost life-size statue of the Roman god of Mars. This one is 4th century in date, so it dates from around the year AD 300. It was found in 1880 in a place called Bar Convent, which is on the southwest side of York. If you know York, it's up Micklegate, through Micklegate Bar, and heading off towards the Mount. So this is a part of the city, so it's immediately outside of the built-up Roman civilian part of the city, and it's heading out on a road which is surrounded by gravestones. It's sort of a ritualized area of the city on a slight hill looking above it. So he was found in 1880 in this group in a pit together with 3 other altars. So Roman altars are small stone objects with inscribed objects on them, with inscriptions on them, and one of them was also depicted dedicated to Mars. What this tells us is there's probably some sort of cult centre in this part of York in which Mars was clearly related to it, and it's been sort of taken down and buried quite carefully. This isn't a statue, although it isn't complete. This hasn't been defaced, it hasn't been destroyed. It's been quite carefully curated and placed in the ground. So looking at the statue here, there's a lot of familiarity with that Republican, sort of that much earlier depiction of the classical Mars. But this is still familiar in his form more than 500 years later. So he has this cuirass, this body armor on. So you can see he's got kind of his six-pack in here, and his pecs are shown on it. So it's very familiar. The other one, he's got the pleated plate skirt underneath him. He has the greaves in the same place. You can just sort of make them out on his knobbly knees. And here, his feet are missing, but the statue would have stood on top of a plinth. He's got this big sort of bandolier over his chest, and it holds a sword, a gladius, quite high on his left-hand side. In his left arm, he's holding a big round oval shield, which is sort of Greek, sort of familiar to a sort of Roman soldier called an auxiliary. It isn't sort of a Roman legionary one, even though this is a legionary base. And his right arm, as you can see, is obviously missing. And on top of his head, he's got this very similar helmet, this Greek-style helmet. It doesn't cover your face and your eyes, a big plume on the top, and this is a much more youthful figure of Mars. This also looks a lot more Romano-British, and just sort of in the way that it's executed. It's made of a kind of stone. This is a very coarse-grained sandstone, so this is a stone that probably came from the bedrock in and around York itself. So this is a local, regional, provincial representation of Mars. His arm out here, just like the little statue, would have held a spear out within it. It's entirely possible that it would have held an actual spear with a wooden haft and some sort of metal head within it. So this is obviously on a completely different scale. The small copper alloy ones are something that are related to individual, perhaps domestic shrines. This is a big monumental figure. This is a cult statue that's going to be related to a temple or some sort of monumental setup in this part of York. It looks kind of brown right now. It wouldn't have originally. So there's been a little bit of analysis we've been able to do on it to find pigments, trace elements of pigments that have survived in it. Like most ancient statues, he would have been painted. So he would have probably had flesh tones in and around the bits of his skin that you could see. There would have been a lot of red. There's evidence for gold, bits of blue and green hidden within it. So this is sort of a riot of colour. It's a much greater sensory experience within it. And its role as a cult statue, it would have been adorned with flowers. It would have had offerings underneath it. It might have been stained by bits of soot from candles and oil lamps that are burning within it. So at some point in York's history, we have this cult centre maybe in and around the southeast part of York that's related to Mars, the Roman god of war. This kind of makes sense because York was built as a Roman legionary fortress. There were 5,000 to 6,000 professional soldiers here at any one time. It was also a veteran colony, so when those soldiers finished their term of service, they were often awarded land grants or money, and many of them would set on the area. So there's a big sort of military component to the history of York, and this would have been a very apt figure to have within it. This very much isn't the most likely way that you're actually going to encounter Mars in York. If we return to the case very quickly, in the corner, you won't be able to see it in high detail on the live stream, but this is about 1 centimetre tall. This is a Mars that's carved into, this is a kind of chalcedony, it's red jasper. So this is a stone. It's a stone, we call it an intaglio, which was set into a fingering. And this has Mars. You can probably make out many of the same sort of figures there. So he has a helmet on, he's armoured, he's carrying a shield behind him, you see in the back left of that image. And this is a much more common depiction of Mars that you'll find in Roman Britain. There are hundreds of these sorts of examples that turn up. On the tray in front of me, so you can get a little more of a sense of a scale. You won't be able to make out the detail, but this is the top half of another one. So this is Mars, his helmet's at the top. You might be able to see just the very back end of parts of his shield behind him. And this one is obviously snapped in half. Put that down. And here I've just got, these are just a pair of finger rings, so you can get the sense of how these things would have been worn. So it's going to have been set within gold, silver, bronze, even iron finger ring, and these are worn on the body. Now, to be able to see that, so whilst these are personal adornment, it's a public thing to be able to show that you're wearing this ring. The actual detail on it isn't going to be known to anybody who isn't in quite close proximity and quite intimate proximity to your hand to be able to see it in kind of detail, what's on it. And these are very common things, these sort of objects. But for the person who wore it, this is somebody who's deliberately associating themselves with Mars, the god of war. This might be because they have a background in the military, or they were active in the military at the time. Mars has some other aspects to him, so he's sort of a general protector god. He's also related to agriculture and the continuing harvest. He's got a sort of a kind of a countryside aspect to him as well. The pair of these, so the one that was on the case and this little part of the fingering on here, so these were both found together in 1972 in a sewer in York. This sewer came out of the bathhouse in the military part of the city, so it's the military bathhouse, which shows us that, which means it's ended up down the drain while somebody was in the sauna, essentially, in the 2nd or 3rd century AD. They would have been almost completely naked, but have managed to kept this fingering on because it's something that's high value, both in terms of its wealth, but also as kind of its sort of associations with it. People like to keep these things on even when they have nothing else on. Part of the steam and the heat of the bathhouse often undoes the glue that's underneath these things, so a lot of them end up getting washed down the drain, and that's why we find a lot of them in York. So those three depictions of Mars bring us nicely round to our 4th one. So this is Mars as a cavalry man. This is from the Ryedale Hoard, so it's in colour it's very similar to the first Mars that we saw, this copper alloy, a bronze if you like, and what will now be very familiar. So he has a helmet on. There are 2 bits missing where his plume would have risen above his head. He's got that cuirass on. This one doesn't have the kind of the muscles depicted on it. And he's got the plated skirt beneath him, but he's obviously the major difference of this is that he's riding a horse. This, in all of its execution, is a very Romano-British kind of representation of Mars. You might think it just looks a little bit unusual, so this ties a lot to sort of, I don't like the word native, but sort of British or traditional Romano-British artistic styles. And you can see other examples of this in and around the country, this sort of thing. It's quite a weighty object, it's a couple of 100 grams within it. It's not complete, much like the other ones, so the horses, you can see it wouldn't stand up. So it would have had a base underneath it, again, probably in copper alloy, so it would have been a freestanding figurine when it was original. He is missing from this part of his left arm. There would have been a shield that's going to be attached to him, and up here, you can see where his hand is missing. So this is where he would have held a spear. So we've got 3 Marses all missing spears, so because these are quite delicate objects and these have then snapped off. But this is a Mars that is kind of in active military campaign. He's in this really aggressive pose. Whilst the others are standing quite serenely, this Mars is chasing someone. He's actively hunting, he is fighting, he is doing something a little bit different. The horse that's on it and the location that it's found does link this a little bit more to this rural, this agricultural aspect of Mars. Horses are the main way that one of the fastest way to travel around Roman Britain on all the paved and unpaved roads that we can find around the area. Where this was found, there aren't any other big Roman settlements nearby. There aren't even any small Roman settlements that we're aware of yet. So it isn't a big urban centre where there are lots of soldiers stationed there and can kind of worship a cult statue like we have with the big one, with the Mars next to me. So this is a small, personal, portable object that's been carried around. Why it ended up in a field in Ryedale in the 2nd century with these other objects that we don't know. There are some suggestions in kind of academics' works that images and depictions of religious figures can't be easily disposed of. So there's a depiction of Marcus Aurelius the Emperor, so the Emperor is deified at this point. Once the Emperor has died, it's very difficult to get rid of that because as an emperor, as a god, he was deified. That object then has kind of latent power associated with it. This might be true of this small depiction of Mars. Maybe it's got broken and then you can't just melt it down and get rid of it in any sort of normal way. You have to sort of respect the figures that are depicted on them. So they're used in certain ritual activities, the nature of which we don't really know about, but the gathering of these objects together speaks of somebody having a very specific idea that they're trying to achieve something, whether they're trying to worship Marcus Aurelius or Mars or whoever it's going to be. This is a collection of objects that have been brought together for a very specific ritual reason. The horse aspect to it, and there's the plumb bob that exists in the Horde as well. These at least speak a little bit about this rural, this agricultural nature of Mars. The fact that we have 4-5 different Marses here on display doing different things showed that he was a god for many different people. So it's a god that you can go to a temple and worship. It's a god that you can have on your own personal shrine or be personally associated to. It's a god that you can wear, so he's aesthetic as well. And so within this, it shows kind of the malleability of Mars as a god within Roman Britain. He was a very popular god, and whether he was the most popular, we don't know. But at least here within York, he would have had an important place because of that relationship to the military, and Roman Britain as well, which is quite a military, sort of a military zone. He would have been a very familiar figure. I seem to have run out of steam, so I think that is where we stop. Do we happen to have any comments, questions from people who might be live watching? That's okay. We'll apologise once more for any tech problems, and I hope that was at least interesting. So do check out the other videos that we've done about the Rydell Horde, which will introduce the objects individually in much more detail, but also talk about some other different aspects of characters within it, and you can find them all on our YouTube at York Museums Trust. Do follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and TikTok for all the Yorkshire Museum content. The exhibition on the Rydell Horde will be open until summer next year.